Fatal1ty is one of the greatest players in the history of esports across all games. He's someone whose prize money totals more than $456,000 according to esports earnings. He played in Quake 3, he played in Doom 3, he played in Alien vs Predator, he played in UT 2003, he played in Counter-Strike very briefly, he played in Quake 4. This is a guy who's played many different titles and won numerous titles and had numerous times when he was a top player. I mean, out of the 7 or so years he competed, I'd say at least 3 or 4 of those, he was absolutely a top elite level player, one of the best in the world, sometimes the best in the world. And yet, even though to casual fans of esports have heard of the name and they've heard of his accomplishments and they've seen his branding and his marketing, which has been very successful in terms of hardware like mouse pads and graphics cards, etc., it is the case that amongst the hardcore community, particularly of the duel games, which he was most famous for playing in, he always got downplayed a bit. Now, part of the reason why, which I can understand to a degree, is that, first of all, a number of the people we're talking about were Europeans, and so some of them didn't necessarily like his attitude. They thought he was cocky, even though actually he's just, I mean, to a degree he's cocky, sure, but it's more like in a confident American cultural kind of way, which sometimes it doesn't always fit with European sensibilities, where sometimes in Europe people who are very good at something are expected to be humble and go, oh no, I'm not the best, you know, there are many people who are good. That will clash at that, and so naturally people want the person to lose, and they figure out reasons as to why this person had an advantage, why they weren't really as good as everyone thought they were. And so I feel like even though he's one of the all-time greats, he gets downplayed in certain ways. And so I want to address some of that in this video, because while I agree there were times where people were better and certain people exceeded him in certain areas, I think people don't fully acknowledge how great this guy was and across his whole career. So let's start in Quake 3, the game that really made him famous. He had played Quake World, but he'd been a young guy, he'd been on high ping on 56k modem, so he wasn't a great player. He wasn't particularly known outside of a small part of the North American scene. So in Quake 3, the game where he became the dominant player, and at one point in time he was the best Quake 3 player we'd seen, people even downplay his run in Quake 3. They talk like as though, because it was only for the first year and a half, that because 04 came afterwards and was fantastic and very dominant himself, like, oh, because 04 came along, who cares about Fatal1ty before? And then obviously after that we had Cooler, we had CZM, and we had Cypher. Because of the progression of the game, people make out as though Fatalities wasn't particularly impressive. You have to understand, Fatal1ty was a very dominant champion. This is a guy where, at the exhibition tournament that was held early on in Quake 3, which was the XS Reality Invitational, which had a number of legendary players. It was like great Quake 2 players, great Quake World players, a couple of Quake 3 players, and everyone was playing Quake 3 in this. Okay, some of the players were wanting to go pro, and some of them only played a bit, so not all the results were super legit, but he went undefeated at this tournament. He wrecked everyone, including people like Machiavelli, who'd been on top at the end of Quake 2. Then you had the Razer CPL, which was the first big major. There'd been other CPL events before, but this was the one where essentially everyone who was a good player and everyone who aspired to be a pro and a top pro in Quake 3 attended this event and gave it their damnedest to try and win that title, because he won $40,000 if you came in first place. He won this tournament, and he wasn't defeated in this tournament. He was fantastic throughout it, and he won against all the competition he faced, even though some came from different countries and all sorts of different backgrounds, and some of them he hadn't practiced and played against before, and he defeated all of them, and he had the dominant style, this very routine style, and a very well-rounded skill set that was polished. Then after that, so he won the first 2 tournaments almost with ease. He's clearly the best player. Okay, yeah, he did go to the Atomic Asia tournament, the CPL event that was in Asia after that. I think it was in Singapore or something. And yeah, okay, he lost here in an upset, but he came back and beat the same guy that he'd been upset by, this guy called S21, who's a Korean. And then, yes, he lost in the final to a guy called Blue, but that was actually because Blue was one of the most skilled players in the whole world, one of the most skilled Quake players ever, in terms of like raw aim and technique, and had, for that particular tournament, studied Fatal1ty and applied a very specific strategy on this one map, DM13, which won him the tournament. But you see, Fatal1ty still came top 2 at that tournament. Then later on, there was the Battletop USA tournament, which was the big NA qualifier to get you into what was going to be the World Cyber Games Challenge, which eventually became the World Cyber Games a year later, but this was the precursor event. But in many ways, as good as the first World Cyber Games. He won the Battletop qualifier over 04, who we all knew at this point in time was starting to become a fantastic player and show off his skills, but he outplayed him. He even outplayed him on Tourney 4, which later on, with the Pro Tourney 4, would become the best map for 04. And he could outplay him on a map like this, which was supposed to be rail heavy. Fatal1ty wasn't considered some godlike railer, but he used it in a utilitarian way and actually outperformed 04 in this sense. Then we had the World Cyber Games Challenge. He went there. Numerous of the best players in the world were there. He beat 0-4. He beat Lakerman, his big rival, who'd been a great player and a very well-rounded player. He beat both these guys. He won the gold medal at this tournament. He was the number 1 player. He went to CPL Cologne in Europe towards the end of the year. He beat the field of top Europeans. This was a really stacked European event here. He beat out Lakerman again. He beat out Fatal1ty, who was this really scary Russian who no one had faced up against in the West, and everyone was really wondering how would it happen if they went up against them. He managed to beat him in a clutch game in the final on T2. He went to the CPL Pacific event the next year. Admittedly, this wasn't a very good field. This was just a couple of good players. Like it had Elan, was a skilled Korean player. It had Python, who was a good Australian player. He won this tournament. His worst finish in Quake 3, essentially, was when he finished 7th place at Babbage's, the next massive major event. 7th is still pretty good, and that was another super stacked tournament where most of the results actually were huge upsets, and that's the one where 0-4 took over. Even when 0-4 then had taken over, Fatality went to CPL Holland the next year in 2001. And he finished top 3 here. He finished 3rd. Okay, yes, he lost to Death, another Russian player that we didn't know much about, but came with this aggressive, impressive style and nice aim. He lost to Lakerman finally. Still finished top 3. Still a very solid, consistent performer. And his best tournaments was obviously dominant. And then QuakeCon 2001. By this point in time, he's starting to move out of the game anyway. There's going to be other titles. Obviously, there's been Alien versus Predator, these sorts of games. It's clear that he's not going to be this super dedicated Quake 3 player. He's still one of the best. He still finishes top 2 at this event. Yes, he loses to 0-4. This was when 0-4 was in beast mode when he was the dominant player. So Fatality, very good Quake 3 player. Really consistent, great run, times of absolute excellence, times when he was just a very, very well polished all-round player, even when he wasn't the number 1. So you can't downplay his Quake 3 career. That's ridiculous. But let's move into some of the other games. So for Alien vs Predator, which he only played 1 tournament, admittedly, Unreal Tournament 2002, and Doom 3, Unreal 2003 rather, and Doom 3, for these 3 titles, he won his tournaments or was the best early on. And so what people say is, this is how they're trying to bring him down. They go, he's only good at games when they first come out. When the game first comes out, he practices loads more than everyone else, and everyone else is just playing for fun, and then that's why he wins early on. But then when everyone else starts to practice more and everyone else learns the game more, they catch up and they overtake him, and he's not good anymore. Right? First of all, the way that's phrased, that's the thing I've heard many times, is ridiculous. Because the idea he's only good, no. Because that history doesn't show that in terms of results. First of all, a number of these games, he's clearly elite or still very good, even after that period where he's put in all the work early on and won the titles and other people start to catch up. He's still a very good player. So, okay, yeah, he won the Unreal Tournament CPL Winter 2002, but when he dropped off at ESWC 2003, he still finished top 4. He's still potentially contending for the title. This was many months afterwards where a number of the Unreal Tournament players had a chance to go ham and they didn't have any of the problems they had at the American tournament. So there's no excuses. He was still an elite level player. That's not the notion that he's only good in that particular sense. Likewise, at Doom 3, yes, he maybe got this early advantage where he got to play the game supposedly before it came out or something, and he got a few weeks on everyone else. For that one, I'll acknowledge that one does seem like maybe he had some advantages over others, but he was still a good player even after that. Even in other tournaments later on, he was still a player that was definitely had to be noticed and could have top finishes still, even though obviously Doom 3 never went on to be a massive game in terms of a huge circuit. I'd also counter that as good as he was at Doom 3 in the early days, and he maybe had this advantage, you do know at the exact same time that he was trying to practice for this Doom 3 QuakeCon tournament, well, that's in the summer, and the summer circuit has CPL Summer, but he wasn't playing Doom 3 there. He was playing Painkiller there, a brand new game for him, and he was playing that, and also, a month before that, he'd had ESWC, and he had top finishes at these tournaments in Painkiller in 2004. So yes, he had Doom 3, but he was also practicing other games at the same time. A bunch of the players playing Doom 3 weren't necessarily practicing the Painkiller. A bunch of the players playing Painkiller weren't practicing Doom 3. So actually, this just shows how fantastic he is at practice. Now, it's clear, yes, one of his biggest strengths was a skill for mastering games early on, knowing the know-how of how to master a game, how to apply yourself, and how to be disciplined enough to really put in those hours early on. That's something to be lauded, not to be put against you as a knock, because that's what haters do. It's the idea that, if I just practice as much as you, I could be as good. Go ahead then. You won't, and you probably can't. It's very simple to say, you just played 10 hours a day. Playing 10 hours a day is incredibly grueling. It takes a very determined, special type of person and personality to be able to do that and to be able to succeed from it, not to get worn down and ground down and feel like shit and have a few bad results and just mentally be a lowest. So that's actually very remarkable and admirable that he was able to do this. Also, it's not just that he was the best at mastering the game in this sense, he was also one of the best at knowing when to peak. So part of the reason why at these early tournaments he would be good is there could be other players who practiced a lot, who were as good as him skill-wise, but many of these players, it's only if everything about them was the absolute best that they'd win the tournament, or if everything went perfectly well that they'd win the tournament. The great thing about Fatal1ty, where he had so many consistent results and why he did usually win the big tournaments, is because he understood how to practice so that you used events, so you gradually improved aspects of your game as it went along. And then you didn't put in all your practice for the first event out of the 3 if that was a smaller one. You put in some practice, then you saw how it went in that event, then you put in more, and you built it up so that you were never burned out when the main event came. Instead, you were at your best when the main event came, and then as the tournament went on, you were at your best and you got better and better at each round of the tournament. This is one of the skills that Fatal1ty learned that many esports pros today do not know. They get burned out before big tournaments because they won some small tournaments and went super ham on them, and then they try to go super ham before every tournament, or they take time off before tournaments. A lot of people still don't have this skill set because this is a true athlete's mindset and mentality, and that's one of the things that he was able to master. It's also the case that it doesn't work to say he's only good at the beginning of games, because he was a late starter to some games he was very successful in, and some he had strong finishes in anyway, even though the game was years into the game. So a great example of the latter would be, okay, everyone who says he's only the best at Quake 3 because he had a PC before everyone else and he had like sponsorship and he was practicing more. Okay, remember, Quake 3 came out, I think, in 1999. In 2001 was when I said, he's already dropped off at this point because 04's in God Mode, 04 won Babbage's, and then Fatal1ty didn't win CPL Holland, that was won by Death, and then 04 won QuakeCon 2001. So that's 2001 here. His prime ended in late 2000 for Fatal1ty. Well, in 2002, he went to QuakeCon, he started practicing Quake 3 again, came back to Quake 3 after playing games like Alien vs Predator, and he played in QuakeCon 2002, beat 04 on DM6 and made it to 3rd place overall in this tournament. That was another really stacked field with some very good players in it, and was this close to getting to the final except for a miracle game from a guy called Dayla. So this is years into the game, and when everyone's had a chance to catch up and play as much as they want and figure out all the styles of the game, he's still an elite level player and with a fantastic performance against, at the time, the dominant player and one of the best players ever, 04. Then you look at the games where he was a late starter but became one of the best. This is where it doesn't work to say that he's just the best at the beginning and for those reasons, as in giving excuses to the other players. It's part of because of his skill of mastering the game. So Quake 4 was a game he came to very late. People like Cooler, Toxic, Fox, Socrates, Sturmy had all been playing and practicing this game like a year or many months before and attended numerous tournaments before then. And Toxic was already the best player, much ahead of everyone else. But along came Fatal1ty, and he was able to accomplish some things there, wasn't he? He was able to manage to come... Let me think, what was the actual results in Quake 4? I think he managed to... He was at the WSVG ISC in 2006, and at this one he finished 4th. He finished ahead of people like, I think it was Socrates and Fox, both elite level players, very good players, some of the world's best players. Then at the WSVG finals itself, which was the great grand final to the end of the circuit, he was able to beat Cooler, who was still a skilled player. Socrates, considered the best NA player by some. He was able to beat Toxic in a series, even though at the time very few people had ever beaten Toxic in a series, especially when he was in this dominant form, and finished 2nd at this massive final that again had all the best players trying to win all that money because it was a lot of money on the line. That was a game he came along late to. Painkiller, he came along late to in the sense of applying this practice work ethic that people think is the only reason he was ever good. Okay, yes, he'd played Painkiller when it had been the ESWC days, 2004. But then in 2005, when the CPL World Tour came around, early on, he was playing, but he wasn't kicked into the full mode of people like Vu and the others who were going super ham every event trying to win. Admittedly, actually, Vu's a bad example there. Some of the other players, though, were very dedicated. Once he did get going, we saw it wasn't just early on in Painkiller's success. He had his best success in the latter half of Painkiller. And the latter half of the circuit in 2005 was when he started to put together this run where he had like 5 circuit events where he finished top 2 and won like 3 of them or something. And then at the finals itself, he won the finals, including beating from the lower bracket the god of Painkiller, which was Vu, the best player we've probably ever seen. So people underrate his Painkiller run for sure. He was closer to Vu than people think. Not in terms of overall skill set. Vu, if you just put him in any Painkiller game and you ignore a tournament setting or whatever, he was fucking unreal. He was just so naturally gifted at this game, and he'd figured out all the tips and tricks and secrets to the game. The problem is, put him in competition mode, yes, Vu was still so good. He won most of the tournaments, and he was by many considered the best player over the circuit. Probably was when you look at all of his results. I think the worst finish he ever had on the circuit was 3rd place. That's how fucking unreal this guy was. But the reason why Fatality was closer than people let on is because Fatality was clutch. Because Fatality knew how to peak at the biggest tournament. That's why he won the biggest tournament, unlike Vu. He was the guy where he finished top 2 at 6 stops in a final and was able to be the next guy who was... Basically, it was Vu, Fatality, and then the others down here. Yeah, people like Strider were fantastically talented. Sturmy was really consistent. You had guys like Stellam won an event. It didn't matter. ZYZ was a fantastic player. None of these could really compare to what Fatality accomplished in Painkiller, though. And this was not at the beginning. This was 6 months or more, or 9 months or a year into Painkiller being out as a competitive game, and then 6 months into it being a very competitive game on the CPL World Tour. So fantastic in Painkiller as well. I've already described Quake 4. If you want to talk about this guy's skill set, like essentially, one last final point I should say. I get why some people say the thing that you only practiced early on. That's cause for games like Doom 3 and to a much bigger degree, Alien vs Predator. Sure, the game really was only about those first tournaments. And yes, he was probably the one who practiced the most, and some of the players he played there weren't pros and they were just good at that game or whatever. So okay, for those ones he did get an advantage, but it's unfair to take that and conflate all of his career like that and be really disingenuous and make out like his whole career was like just winning the first tournament and then eventually people catching up because they played the game more. That's really ludicrous. In terms of the guy's skill set, he was a guy who never had the best aim in the world in any of these games I watched. He always had good aim. He always had top 10 aim, certainly. In some of these games, perhaps top 5, especially with certain weapons. But the thing about him was he always had the consistently good aim, which he knew how to use effectively. He was very effective with weapon switching and knowing what weapon to use in what situation. That's why he never had to be one of the best railers. No one ever picked him out as one of the best rail players in the world. But his rail was really good. It was really efficient, and he would use it in the situation where it was important. In terms of style, he really did pioneer the hard running of the very specific pattern map control style, where you use rote and you use rhythm to run the map the same way over and over again. And if the opponent can't do anything about it, tough shit. And then you get in control and you just keep running it like that and you just rack up the score and you win the game. This is what he was fantastic at. And people had a hard time getting into his head in this sense and understanding why his pattern was so good when they would do a different pattern or they would just contest one particular item for a certain fight. And some people thought about the game differently, but the way he had thought about it at the time for the first year and a half of Quake 3 particularly, and this applied to other games, you could see that there was a logic to this and it was a very consistent approach. Later on, it's true, he did develop a very defensive style. Another reason why I think people always tried to downplay him and didn't like him is from like 2003 onwards, especially in UT, where he started to have some issues and he didn't qualify for World Cyber Games, etc. It felt like he did become a bit overly defensive now. Now he tried to play like almost like a, if you think of in the UFC, like MMA or boxing, like a point fighter. He tried to play so that he was just, if he was up by 1, he would just try to win by 1 frag, and he would try to just keep it up. Unless he got a perfect scenario, he's just going to maintain the lead. And that style, okay, it can be work if you're fantastic defensively. Like we know, obviously, that famously in the 2000s, the New Jersey Devils used to have this style where if they scored a goal, forget everyone was behind the puck and they was trying to defend and win because they had a sick goalie, Brodeur. But the problem with this style is it can work, and it did still work in a number of tournaments. But in general, it also means that when you're facing fantastic players, they might then only need one little moment to go right to get back in the game suddenly. Whereas if you'd have taken a few more chances and you'd run up the score a little bit, you'd have more of a cushion, which is maybe one of the issues there. Now, that is mainly later on when he's being more of a pro and he's trying to just win tournaments. Early in his career, before he became the dominant Quake 3 player, he was a very flashy player. I remember at Frag 3, he was the guy where he was rocket jumping around and going really aggro towards people and trying to get in their face with the lightning gun, the rocket launcher. Now, if anything, he refined that to somewhere between the two positions to become the dominant player in Quake 3. It's also true, in terms of strengths, what I said before, he had this ability to peak, to know how to practice for a tournament, what tournament to skip, to maintain this proper pacing to your practice, how to improve throughout a tournament, how to even play in a tournament so you're not staying up too late, you're not having the wrong food, you're not coming at the wrong time, you're not playing against the wrong opponent. He would get people to play with him, like a game or two, someone who's a friend of his who he knew how he'd play in the hotel room, so he'd be kind of warmed up. He understood how to peak very, very well. And likewise, he actually mastered something that a lot of these other guys could have done, but they never thought to, which is he would practice privately with lesser players sometimes. Sometimes to keep things away from other players in terms of what he would do in the tournament, but also just so he had the same kind of practice partner. So he knew, right, I have an idea what's going to happen here. This guy's keeping me in shape. Also, so that he'd have someone who practice whenever he wanted. If another player, some fantastic Swedish player, only is going to practice when another fantastic Swedish player's there, or only take practice seriously when they are, then they're not going to get as good practice as Fatality in. He's going to get his hours hours in, no matter who he can play against, in his servers, at his little LANs, at his boot camps, in his hotel room. He's just going to find a way to get the practice he needs. He's not just going to have other factors out externally determine how good he can be as a player. Now, obviously, as a marketing expert, in terms of esports, he was one of the first to really have success, to really brand himself, not just as a top player and win prize money, but then to make a lot of money from endorsements and from being the spokesperson for things and for actually having merchandise that you yourself have branded and sold. He had fantastic success in this respect. Obviously, one thing that we can all agree upon, which is one of the main things people derided him for, is when he would say he was like a 12-time world champion. Yes, if you go and look at most of those tournaments, most of them were not what I would consider world championships in those games. Realistically, he was probably a world champion 2 or 3 times. That's a pretty good still to win 2 or 3 world championships. And he won another number of smaller events or medium events, which he's talking about otherwise. So he was still fantastic. You can't take that away from him. Now, obviously, also, in terms of merchandising, early on, some of it was a little bit cheesy. Like the fat pad, his mouse pad that he made, was basically just the big printer pad that they sold in CompUSA for a couple of dollars that he took, changed a tiny bit, put his logo on, changed the color of, and sold for like $10 more, $20 more. That's a great concept, though. That is a great way to make money. I admit, though, it seems a bit cheesy if you know where it's coming from, and if people buy it thinking it's like some extremely uniquely designed mouse pad that has some special abilities. No, it's just a nice cloth pad that was big. I think also one of the reasons why people don't like him is they think that because he went to new games where he could use these skills to dominate and to take over people because he knew how to practice a game and how to learn a game, he's a very fast learner, and how to peak, people thought that he ducked and dodged people in Quake 3 because he went to these other games. But that doesn't really work, because if he ducked and dodged people, then why, when he went to play Alien vs Predator, did he come back to play QuakeCon 2001 in Quake 3 and risk losing to 0-4, who was the best player in the world at the time, and did in fact lose to him? Why did he come back in 2002 for QuakeCon when we've already had 0-4? We have players like Lexa. We have fantastic players, CZM. Why risk playing those guys? He wasn't. It's not that he was unwilling to play them. He was willing to them. In fact, he looked forward to playing guys at 0-4, and he obviously beat 0-4 at 2002, even though he lost in 2001. People also overblow his lack of success in team games. Yeah, he's mainly a 1v1 player because that's his mentality. He has that kind of like Tiger Woods, Roger Federer mentality to how to always be the best. He's not necessarily much of a team player in the other sense, but he did have some fantastic success in team play. He played in Quake 3 in Clan Capital, and they were undefeated for like 2 years in all the competitions they played. One LAN, Frag 4, and numerous online cups. Now, it's true, the star player, and in many ways like the Messi of that team, was obviously CZM, but you don't make out like Fatality was some terrible scrub bench player. He was like the fucking Ian Esther or the Javi of that team. He was another very good player as well that they really relied upon. It was the other members of the team who maybe were a bit less skilled, but with the team players or knew how to play around them, he was one of the main forces as well, even though, yes, CZM was the master of TDM, and in many ways, one of the greatest of all time. He's someone, I think, yes, you can dislike his attitude and you can think he's cocky, or you don't like the way he marketed certain aspects, or you might not like, for your own personal reasons, even though I think it's a bit petty, the fact that he left a game after a year or two and didn't just play for 3 straight years. And because he saw opportunity elsewhere, or he decided he wanted to play a different game. He doesn't have to play for you as the fan, by the way. Plays for his own amusement, his own competition. And it's funny, when people like 0-4 left for a few years, no one really called them out as like cowards and said that they were afraid to lose to the modern players, mainly because they had maybe more amiable personalities, or they weren't perceived to have ever been cocky, and people didn't mind that they retired. It's interesting the double standard people have there, but I think he deserves massive respect. He went straight into 3 full game circuits where he risked everything. Unreal Tournament, that wasn't even vaguely like Quake. It was such a different game, and he went into it and played against the likes of Gitz, who was the god of Quake, of Unreal Tournament, the first one, 99. He went against these guys and tried to compete against them. That's fucking ballsy as shit. And obviously he won the first tournament. He went into Painkiller, another game, nothing like it. You could say it's a bit like Quake World. Not really, though. It had many differences. And again, Vu quickly asserted himself as the god of this. Fatality said, I'll just quit out of this. I'll just become a marketing guy. No, he kept playing in the circuit. And even though early on he wasn't doing that well, he was coming like 6th and 4th and 3rd, he kept fighting and battling and playing until he became top 2. And then he was actually winning events over Vu. And eventually he won the big final. This is incredibly admirable stuff. Then Quake 4, where Toxic is already god. He's winning every tournament. He's unbeatable. Fatality comes in, he practices, he puts in the hours, he does his diligence again, he starts to go, and he becomes a top player again. If he was so arrogant, and if he always was deluded and thought he was better than he was, he wouldn't be able to come into these games, especially late on new games, and become so good. Because people who are ultimately arrogant in a way that limits them as a person, and who are incredibly deluded. It does limit them. It stops them becoming better. They think they're better than they are. They always play in a certain way, or they play a stubborn way. They won't adapt to the other aspects. Fatality didn't show any of these signs, actually, in terms of his success. He showed that he was very malleable and could become the best player in numerous different games. He found success in pretty much every game he ever turned his hand to. He was a top player, like I say, for at least 3 or 4 out of the 7 or so years he competed. I think he's a fantastic player. I can understand some aspects of why people don't like him, or why they say he wasn't the best. Okay, you can say that in certain games, but he's certainly accomplished something very special for the whole totality of his career, and considering the number of games he played in and the different circumstances he came into them from. Now, all of my videos are sponsored by Alpha Draft, but obviously pretty much none of the games I've listed now are going to be on Alpha Draft. So it's mainly if you want to play fantasy esports for other games like Dota 2, League of Legends, CSGO, Smite. If so, play at Alpha Draft.